All right, welcome to lesson 24 and 25. We've made it to the end of unit 2. So that means we're going to take everything that we've been putting together in our inequalities half of the unit and pretty much everything we've actually been using since the beginning of unit 2 and finishing up our lesson. So, lesson 24 and 25, let's use systems of inequalities to solve some problems. So, today I'm going to introduce to you what a system of inequalities is. Same thing what a system of equations are. In this case, we're just dealing with inequalities. So a system of inequalities are two or more inequalities that represent the constraint in the same situation, and they form a system of inequalities. And so two or more inequalities that represent the same situation. Like I said, the same thing with a system of equations. This is just inequalities instead of equalities. A solution, or solutions in this case, solutions to a system of inequalities are all pairs of values that make the equations in a system true, are solutions to the system, right? Same thing. All pairs of values that make the inequalities in a system true are solutions to the system. So any values that make the inequalities in both cases true. The solutions of the system of the inequalities can be represented by points in the region where the graphs of the two inequalities overlap. So we're talking about an area now. We're not just talking about one solution, right, where we talked about the point of intersection. In this case, we have a region, a bunch of solutions where they're going to overlap. So I'm going to show you what that example looks like in a couple of minutes. So first things first, I want you to take a look at the four graphs here. I want you to choose a graph and tell me why it does not look the same as the other graphs. I want you to give me a full sentence. Don't just tell me A is different, right? I want you to tell me why you think A is different than all the other graphs. And so I'll give you a few minutes to answer that. Then we will move on to our quilting project. In our quilting project, to make a quilt, the quilter is buying fabric in two colors, light and dark. He needs at least 9.5 yards of fabric total. The light color costs $9 a yard and the dark color costs $13 a yard. The quilter can spend up to $110 on the fabric. So I give you the two graphs that represent the two constraints here. Your first step is to write an inequality represent the length of the constraint. Let x represent the yards of light fabric and y represent the yards of dark fabric. If you need to remember how to write an inequality, go back to lesson 23. Select all pairs that satisfy the length constraint. Write an inequality to represent the cost constraint. Select all pairs that satisfy the cost constraint. So you're writing two inequalities. You're telling me which ones are actually satisfied the each of the constraints. I give you a hint. I also give you the graph, which makes it a lot easier to tell me where the solutions are. And so tell me where those two solutions are. Explain why 2 comma 2 satisfies a cost constraint but not the length constraint. And I want you to find one pair of numbers that satisfies both constraints, and I want you to explain why. And so what does a pair of numbers represent in this situation? I want you to give me a value that represents both in this situation. So what does it mean where it is a solution to both of the constraints? When it's a solution to both of the constraints, if I overlapped these two graphs, if I graph them on the same graph, a solution to both of the inequalities where the shaded sections overlap. So I want you to give me a point in the region where the two shaded regions overlap and tell me what does that represent in context. So if I get this many yards of light fabric and this many yards of dark fabric, it satisfies both constraints. It satisfies the fact that it is under this amount of money and it costs this much and it's this much fabric. Right? Give me that full sentence as you're getting into it. And so when you're talking about your two constraints, right, your two constraints must fulfill. Oops, sorry, I went back too far. Your two constraints that it needs to be at least 9.5 yards and spend up to $110. And so what you're going to tell me is you're going to tell me this many yards of light fabric and this many yards of dark fabric are at least 9.5 yards and cost at most $110 on your fabric. I went through this part a little bit fast because what is everything on this slide connects to all of lesson 23. So if you need to go back to lesson 23 to figure out how to rewrite those inequalities, go back to that lesson. 6 and 7 are what the new portions are. But once you get the first two, all you need to do is tell me where that overlap is, right? Tell me solutions to both inequalities or where the shaded sections overlap. There is more than one answer. You can give me multiple right answers in this situation. And so give me one answer that is a solution to both of your inequalities and show me what that means in context. Here's a graph of the inequalities of the system. I want you to explain whether each point is a solution to the system. Be prepared to explain how you know. I just went over, right, the solutions to both inequalities where the shaded sections overlap. So tell me which one of these is a solution to the system and explain how you know it is a solution to both. And so we're going to talk about one situation you've seen before. We talked about our concert tickets. We learned this from our last lesson. In that last lesson, you had two different constraints for the one situation. I want you to write a system of inequalities to represent the constraints. I will give you a hint. If you did your homework for lesson 23, you can just copy them down from lesson 23 and you'll save yourself the time. I want you to graph the inequalities and sketch the solutions to the region, use the labels and scale the axes. Like I said, if you did your part for lesson 23, you do not have to worry about doing this from scratch. You can just go back to your last homework and just sketch it from before. Identify a solution to the system. Now, this is the new part. I want you to graph it on the same axes. I want you to identify a solution to the system and explain what the numbers mean in this situation. Like I said, you want a full sentence here. I want you to tell me that this many lawn tickets were sold, this many sea tickets were sold. That gives you a total of less than 400 and at least 14,000, right? Give me a full sentence, and I'll try to give you some sentence structure in your in your guided notes as well, so it'll help you with your sentence in there. And so your goal is to give me a solution to the system. So we're going to take lesson 23 and take it a step further from that. And so our learning targets for today, I can write a system of inequalities to describe a situation, find the solution by graphing, and interpret the points in the solution. And I know what's meant by the solution to a system of inequalities and describe the graphs of those situations. And we're going to given descriptions and graphs that represent two different constraints. I can find the value that satisfies each constraint individually and values that satisfy both constraints at once. We're going to talk about this more, but remember lesson 24 and 25 represent the end of the unit. This encompasses everything that we've been talking about over the past few months. And so let's wrap it up together and we'll get into lesson 5 after this. So I look forward to seeing you there.